Welcome to the Anti-Library Podcast. Tonight, since it's getting to be that spooky time of the year, we are talking about our favorite ghost stories and trying to explore the nature of the ghost in literature. Grab your tea, dim the lights, and let's get into the dark side of fiction. And before we start, let me just remind you, please like, share, and subscribe if you think our content is useful.
Tonight, we're not here to talk about cheap thrills or jump scares. Although we'll still talk about haunting castles and monsters, we are here to explore the heart of the dread and ask some questions, such as why do we get attracted to and indeed take pleasures in things that we fear? Why have ghosts occupied such an enduring place in literature and movies, culture in general, across the globe? So, Ashmita, I know you love horror movies and books, but also kind of get spooked by them. Why do you like them though?
I find horror thrilling. There is pleasure in pursuing what happens next, and I want to know what is going to unfold in the plot. I also think I kind of want the humans to win over the ghosts. After all, ghosts are something quite different from humans, especially those horror elements which are explicitly identified as evil. I'm cheering for the humans and I do not want them to be helpless victims. But that does not mean all ghosts are evil. Some ghosts are also kind of relics of humans, past humans with unfulfilled desires and so on. I want to know why the ghosts became ghosts in the first place and what they want. I love to psychologically study people, and that's no different with ghosts.
So, you want to know the ghosts? That's interesting. I think I feel intrigued about the ghosts because they are not fully knowable.
I think ghosts both provoke curiosity, so you want to know them, but you realize you actually cannot. There is a specific sense of unknowability in ghosts, like even when they get hold of humans, they can never really tell them their full story. Some hauntings, which are more assertively non human, such as objects, like the Annabelle doll or grimoires, actually get sort of activated precisely when humans try to know them. Then there are architectural spaces which provoke the sense of curiosity and yet which are difficult to know, spaces which are half hidden, half revealed, such as winding stairs in a castle or a dungeon.
There are some specific signatures of some ghosts, like the Masque of the Phantom of Opera, which shows they're present even when the humans cannot perceive them. I think the maze, which is used as a key horror element in movies like The Shining, is another kind of horror object which is very interesting, and it's probably my favorite kind. It embodies the sense of allure, curiosity, if you like, that draws people into the maze, as well as the unknowability, the fear of getting lost.
Maze is a great example. I agree, because they capture a philosophical anxiety about the nature of reality itself. Do we really know the reality we are inhabiting? Are we following a pattern which will eventually destroy us? The character played by Jack Nicholson, Jack Torrance, who spends the winter with his family in the Overlook Hotel, steps into a certain pattern of horror which is already there, a certain past which lingers, which the chef Dick Halloran points out. But he is also an alcoholic who has already shown signs of violence towards his family. So his gradual descent into insanity and his attempt to kill his wife and child is both psychological and moral, but maybe also a bit epistemological, as the increasing distortion of reality in the movie suggests. Satoshi Kon's anime, Paprika, where the dream world takes over the real world, captures this sense of epistemological collapse at the heart of horror. The sense that the understanding of reality might be wrong. I agree with the philosopher Noel Carroll and recommend his book, The Philosophy of Horror, that curiosity about the unknowable is at the heart of horror, which is different from the kind of curiosity that detective fiction has, which draws upon our pleasure in solving the puzzle.
It's so interesting that you bring up this contrast between the horror and the detective genres. I think in the movie Paprika, Detective Toshimi Konakawa acts as a mirror for the film's central horror theme, the loss of control over one's own mind and the dissolution of identity. While the theft of the DC Mini, the device to get into people's dreams, presents a large scale external threat, Konakawa's personal storyline makes this psychological terror intensely intimate and visceral. If you notice, early in the film we see Konakawa's troubled dreams, such as he's getting plagued by a recurring violent scenario tied to an unsolved homicide case. Paprika, in a therapeutic capacity, enters his mind to guide him. So she is also a kind of detective figure, right? Konakawa's dreams, full of cinematic tropes, are not just passive entertainment, but a window into a painful, suppressed part of his psyche. Konakawa's horror is rooted in a personal trauma from his youth. He once aspired to be a filmmaker with a friend, but his friend's death and Konakawa's subsequent insecurities caused him to repress his passion and take a more respectable job as a detective. So he frequently says that he hates movies when he actually wanted to be a director. He subconsciously chases and is haunted by the very identity he abandoned.
You are right. In the end, Konakawa is the character in Paprika who most clearly resolves his own internal conflict, and his resolution provides a blueprint for overcoming the film's horror. By finally accepting and embracing his past, represented by his love for cinema, he is able to regain control of his fragmented psyche. This act allows him to help Paprika in the final decisive confrontation with the villains. His journey shows that the antidote to the mind shattering horror is psychological integration and self acceptance. The film's final scene, showing him going to the movies, symbolizes that he has made peace with his dual identity. So, knowledge is in the end therapeutic. It helps in making peace with both the past trauma and the horror that is born out of it.
The collapse of rationality in Kubrick's The Shining is also related to repressed knowledge. The hotel manager, Ullman, explicitly states that the overlook was built on an ancient indigenous American burial ground, linking the hotel's violence to repressed indigenous pasts. The critic, Bill Blackmore, actually famously makes this case, and I would recommend everyone to read his article. Kubrick saturates the set of the film with Native American design motifs, Navajo patterns, cochina doll like figures, Calumet baking powder tins featuring a native chef, and so on. Crucially, the ghosts in the Overlook are generally not indigenous spirits seeking revenge. They're the spirits of the previous white patrons and employees, like Grady, whom our hero meets in a haunted scene. And their goal is to initiate Jack into their established system of domestic violence, which has its own colonial roots. They want Jack to correct his family, becoming an agent of the old patriarchal and colonial violence.
That makes sense, as the Gothic emerges in relation to fears associated with the collapse of the traditional older order of life in the late 18th century. The Gothic emerged in a period of great political instability, signaled by the French Revolution in 1789. The tradition of British Gothic literature begins with Horace Walpole's 1764 work, The Castle of Otranto, where he uses a lot of medieval references, including the giant helmet, winding staircases, a gigantic castle. You get the drift? These symbols literally embody the old aristocratic order, against which Walpole, a Whig politician, would have ideologically stood. Apparently, he got the plot in a dream while residing in Strawberry Hill, a Gothic revival villa in London, and he found in the novel a distraction from the politics.
But the Castle of Otranto, far from being a political distraction for Walpole, deeply captures the political unconscious of its moment of composition. There is this great dramatic moment in the beginning of the novel. The tyrannical lord of the castle, Manfred, sends a servant to summon his son Prince Conrad for his marriage to Lady Isabella. However, the servant returns not with the prince, but with the terrifying news that Conrad has been crushed to death beneath an impossibly large, black plumed helmet that has seemingly fallen from the sky. Since Conrad was his only heir and his wife Hippolyta is now unable to bear more children, Manfred faces the end of his lineage and his claim to Otranto, which has been prophesied all along. In a stunning display of desperate ambition, the definitive Gothic villain Manfred immediately abandons all familial and moral decency. deciding he must secure an heir elsewhere. He sets his sights on the newly widowed Isabella, resolving to divorce his wife and marry his son's betrothed to produce a new male heir for his house. Of course, for many of the Anglican Protestant readers of Walpole, Manfred's world presents the corrupt and superstitious Catholic way of life. The preface to the novel claims the story was found in the library of an ancient Catholic family and was written during, within quotes, the darkest ages of Christianity. And the story is formally set in the period around the Crusades.
Key Gothic novels that defined the golden age of classic Gothic, such as Anne Radcliffe's The Mysteries of Udolpho in 1794 and Matthew Gregory Lewis's The Monk in 1796, are set in the past and in Catholic countries like Italy or Spain. They very much reflect contemporary politics. In his critical essay, Idées sur les romans, the Marquis de Sade, who considered the Monk superior to all other works of Gothic fiction, said that the popularity of the genre was, and I quote, the inevitable result of the revolutionary shocks which all of Europe had suffered, unquote. In a perverse sense, then, the castles and dungeons of classical Gothic were comforting presences of the Ancien Régime, rapidly disappearing in the age of revolutions. These texts shaped some of the key conventions of the Gothic, which the critique, Eve Kosowski Sedgwick, defines in a canonical study, The Coherence of Gothic Conventions, which include, I quote, priesthood and monastic institutions, subterranean spaces and live burial, doubles, the discovery of obscured family ties, possibilities of incest, unnatural echoes or silences, unintelligible writings, and the unspeakable, nocturnal landscapes and dreams, apparitions from the past, and so on.
That is a great list indeed. Thanks, Ashmita. I like how Sedgwick mentions mental states, such as dreamlike states and so on, in the list of Gothic conventions. The shift from the classical late 18th century Gothic to the early 19th century Gothic is marked by shifts from the plot driven terror, ruined abbeys and castles and so on, to psychological horror. Despair, guilt, obsession, all the emotional states we associate with the Gothic now shape up during this period. And this stage of the Gothic can more fruitfully be called horror because it has to more do with the psychology than external events. Anne Radcliffe, I think, is a great transitional figure who starts the tradition of explaining supernatural events in psychological terms. But I also highly recommend Charlotte Decker, especially the novel Zofloya, in making how the setting becomes a mirror for the character's internal turmoil, the signature of the Romantic Gothic. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is, of course, the prime example of Romantic Gothic. It blends classic Gothic elements, such as the pursuit of a monster through desolate landscape, with a deep romantic exploration of the character's hubris, guilt, and existential loneliness.
Before we move too deep into Frankenstein, I heard you made a distinction between terror and horror.
Well, the distinction between terror and horror is sometimes made by Gothic scholars, where terror is more supernatural, something that crosses the bounds of humanity, such as Manfred's actions in the Castle of Otranto. And horror is more psychological, such as the internal regret and guilt and so on faced by the scientist Victor Frankenstein. Terror is a more plot driven device. Horror is sometimes felt by the character, so it is more character driven.
This distinction between horror and terror is helpful in understanding the horror felt by the scientist Victor Frankenstein in the novel Frankenstein. So, yes, the novel is named after the scientist, not the monster. The scientist seeks to penetrate the secrets of life and death, which results in the monster, and his horror is caused by the realization of his terrible creation and his responsibility for it. Initially, the monster is quite likable. It shows innocence, intelligence, and a desire for companionship, which are frustrated by unkind humans. But the monster also shows a tendency for extreme violence, such as the murders of William, Clerval, and Elizabeth, which strikes terror. Again, At the end, it shows remorse and guilt. So, the monster is a complicated motley of humane and inhumane traits. Please let us know in the comments if you would like a full episode on Frankenstein, and do not forget to hit the subscribe button.
But how do we go from the crumbling castles and brooding aristocrats to the pumpkin in the American Halloween? Why does the pumpkin become such an embodiment of the spooky season?
The modern holiday of Halloween traces its roots back to the ancient Celtic festival of Samhain. In the simplest terms, Samhain marks the change of seasons, the shift from the light of summer to the darkness of winter. It typically took place around November. The Celtics believed that at this time of the year, the veil separating the worlds of the living and the dead was at its thinnest. Bonfires, costumes, and sweets were all part of this celebration. As Christianity spread, early church leaders sought to replace or adapt these non Christian rituals within their own holidays. Pope Gregory III officially designated November 1 as All Saints' Day or All Hallows' Day, and November 2 as All Souls' Day. Eventually, the evening before All Saints' Day, that is October 31st, became known as All Hallows' Eve. Over time, this name was shortened and evolved into the holiday we know today as Halloween. But there is also a bit of literary history that made the pumpkin the centerpiece of Halloween horror. Washington Irving's 1820 short story, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, supplies the American blueprint for spooky season with its pumpkin symbolism. The story is set in the Dutch settlement of Sleepy Hollow in New York. Our protagonist is Ichabod Crane, a gangly, superstitious schoolmaster from Connecticut whose primary flaw is a ravenous appetite for food and for ghost stories. Ichabod courts Katrina Van Tassel, the beautiful daughter and the sole heir of the wealthiest farmer in the area. Ichabod's rival for Katrina's hand is Brom Van Brunt, or Brom Bones, the local hero, a mischievous prankster, and a powerful horseman. The famous climax of the story stages a battle between seemingly rational Ichabod, who's representing the new American intellect, and the power of old world folklore embodied by the headless horseman. That iconic image of the rider, lantern in hand, with a pumpkin head, that's a purely American Gothic invention that cemented the pumpkin's place as the supreme symbol of Halloween horror. The story is ambiguous whether the headless horseman really carried Ichabod's soul away, as the villagers suspected, or whether Brom Bones, who later married Katrina, used a pumpkin to scare his rival out of town forever. Spook, trick, and treat all became entangled in this quintessential Halloween story.
That is such a fabulous story, I need to read it. Short story is such a key genre of American Gothic. Washington Irving, Edgar Allan Poe, and Nathaniel Hawthorne are all key practitioners of it. My favorite is, of course, Poe. He blends the supernatural with psychological instability, sometimes having unreliable narrators, leaving the source of the horror ambiguous. For example, in The Fall of the House of Usher, it is unclear whether Madeline's return is supernatural or a product of her brother's madness, and the plot unfolds within a claustrophobic, decaying mansion. Poe's vivid and grotesque descriptions create a haunting, gruesome, suspenseful atmosphere, frequently called the macabre. Examples include the beating heart under the floorboards in The Telltale Heart, with the horrific descriptions of the plague in The Masque of the Red Death. Macabre actually has a very interesting etymological history that derives from the Hebrew makbar or grave, a close cognate of the Arabic makbara or cemeteries. The word gains its significance from its use in French as la danse macabre for the allegorical representation of the ever present and universal power of death in the wake of the Black Death plague epidemic in medieval Europe. And we see this figure recurring in a number of languages, such as in German as Totentanz, and later in English as the Dance of the Dead.
The Masque of Red Death creates the macabre atmosphere where the Prince Prospero and his courtiers have a selfish and opulent party during a plague epidemic, which serves as a stark contrast to the suffering of the populace outside. The atmosphere is steeped in psychological horror. The revelers' increasing anxiety is embodied by the chiming of a gigantic ebony clock. Each chime brings the music and the dancing to a halt, serving as a terrifying reminder that time is running out. The plague itself comes as a masked intruder at the prince's masquerade ball. The spectral figure is dressed like a corpse, inflicted with the Black Death, now dressed in the decadent opulence of red, and its appearance throws the revelers into a panic. When the figure is finally confronted, it is revealed that there is no one behind the costume. It is the disease itself.
The arrival of the plague in the guise of one of the guests in the masquerade in Edgar Allan Poe's The Masque of Red Death signals what the psychoanalyst Sigmund Freud calls the uncanny. Sigmund Freud's 1919 essay, The Uncanny, defines the concept as something familiar that has become frightening through repression, as something that appears as horrific. In a sense, it is a subversion of the original Gothic's focus on external terrors, bringing the source of dread inward within the psyche to explore repressed fears and the psychological instability of characters. Freud explored the close proximity of the homely and the unhomely, Heimlich and Unheimlich in German, finding that the Heimlich or homely holds a contradictory secondary meaning of concealed, hidden, or kept from sight. Gothic tropes such as the double, involuntary repetitions where one finds oneself in the same place over and over again, or certain scenarios repeat, and animation of inanimate objects such as dolls are all symptoms of the uncanny.
A classic case of the doppelganger in Gothic literature is R.L. Stevenson's Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. In the novella, the physician Dr. Henry Jekyll invents a medicine which allows one to separate their good and bad sides from each other, transforming into the evil and grotesque Mr. Hyde when he takes the drug. Notably, Dr. Jekyll's transformation into his evil double Mr. Hyde is not supernatural but facilitated by a scientific experiment. Some scholars have argued that Mr. Hyde is not a real figure but a hallucination of Dr. Jekyll's, an embodiment of his drug addicted, damaged psyche. So, the uncanny figure of the double turns the supernatural horror psychological.
Even though the notion of the double has been expanded and theorized in the Freudian notion of the uncanny, it has actually folkloric origins. There are figures such as the fetch in Irish folklore, which is a double of a family member, often signifying an impending death. The double can be a figural embodiment of personal trauma or addiction, as in the case of Stevenson's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, or it can capture collective trauma and the societal unconscious. A good example is, of course, Toni Morrison's Beloved. The character Beloved is an adult woman who is the physical manifestation of the main character Seth's repressed trauma and the spirit of the infant daughter she killed to save the child from slavery. Beloved's presence at the house 124 Bluestone Road, which is marked as this loud, haunted space, represents the violent return of the unspeakable horrors and trauma of slavery that remain unresolved.
The uncanny brings the strange within the familiar, as Freud suggests. Shirley Jackson's The Haunting of Hill House is a great example to illustrate the Freudian point that in the uncanny, the boundaries between the strange and the familiar, the outside and the inside blur. Hill House is more than just a setting. It feels alive and malevolent. It represents the uncanny by blurring the boundaries between physical world and the characters' internal psychological state. The illogical architecture, the unearthly noises suggest that the building is an external projection of the character's own anxieties and hidden madness.
My favorite Gothic mode is the weird, while the uncanny is an internal processing of the strange. The weird is an external intrusion that reveals the strangeness of our own context. The focus is not on the self or the psyche, as in the case of the uncanny, rather, it is an insidious intrusion that comes from outside the self. I would highly recommend Mark Fisher's The Weird and the Eerie for understanding weird in detail. Please subscribe and stay with us as we untangle the weird and the eerie in the next phase of this episode. Lovecraft succinctly summarizes the weird as, within quotes, a certain atmosphere of breathless and unexplainable dread of outer unknown forces, unquote, in his essay Supernatural Horror in Literature. Weird, interestingly, is not anthropocentric. It's not centered on the subject or the psyche. Rather, it conjures up a cosmological scale of horror that is in some sense indifferent towards humanity. It's impossible to talk about the weird without mentioning Arthur Machen. His work features a mystical sense of the Welsh landscape, interest in Celtic and Arthurian myths, and his exploration of a pre Christian reality seething underneath everyday life. He blends the mystical with the horrifying, the realist and the anti realist elements. Machen initiates what the philosopher Graham Harman has called weird realism in his reading of Lovecraft. Machen's fictional world is filled with forgotten monstrous entities, often referred to as the Little People, a surviving ancient race lurking in the wild places, sometimes infiltrating human society. Some of the key texts that mention the Little People in the Machen Over are the novella The Three Impostors and the short stories The Shining Pyramid, The Red Hand, The White People, and Out of the Earth.
The Machen novel I vividly remember is The Great God Pan, where a surgical experiment opens a woman's mind to a terrifying supernatural reality, leading to madness and horror. It reiterates the themes of scientific hubris that we see in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein as Dr. Raymond, a scientist who believes he can perform a minor surgical procedure upon a young girl named Mary to remove the veil of sense and allow a human to perceive the spirit world, ends up unleashing cosmic horror upon the world. Mary eventually gives birth to Helen Vaughan, a beautiful yet sinister woman who embodies the destructive forces unleashed by Dr. Raymond's experiment. Helen's life is marked by unexplained deaths, madness, and corruption that follow her wherever she goes, leaving a trail of chaos in her wake.
Arthur Machen's The Great God Pan significantly influenced H.P. Lovecraft, providing a template for cosmic horror.
Let's talk about the Cthulhu mythos then. Yes, Cthulhu, not Cthulhu. I find it remarkable how this mythos is a shared creation that goes beyond Lovecraft's own work. The term was coined by August Derleth, a contemporary correspondent and a protege of Lovecraft, to identify the settings, trope, and the lore that were employed by Lovecraft and his literary successors, such as Robert E. Howard, Clark Ashton Smith, Robert Bloch, Fritz Leiber, and so on. The name Cthulhu derives from the central creature in Lovecraft's seminal short story, The Call of Cthulhu, first published in the pulp magazine Weird Tales in 1928.
Lovecraft is a world builder with entities such as the great old ones and outer gods like Kululu and Azathoth, etc. But ultimately, the element of dread he conjures is associated with an existential dread that's difficult to define. His philosophy of cosmicism underlines the irrelevance of humanity when measured against the scale of the cosmos, which is eternal, immense, and chaotic, and a reckoning that our known reality, governed by science, law, habit, etc., is a fragile, thin shell over a terrifying, chaotic, and formless truth. Lovecraft heavily employs the word eldritch, an archaic English word that can be translated as eerie or unearthly, to define what he also calls the non Euclidean nature of horror.
And that brings us to the final category of dread, the eerie. Mark Fisher defines the eerie as a non subjective dread, something born out of abandoned houses, emptied landscapes, created out of husks of history, which nevertheless hang heavy. I think William Faulkner is a master of eerie, and this mode of dread is the keynote of Southern Gothic. Faulkner's work is haunted by the past, particularly the brutal history of slavery and the Civil War. Many of Faulkner's stories are set in decaying plantation homes and towns within the fictional Yoknapatawa County, which symbolize the moral and cultural decay of the Southern way of life after the Civil War. The setting of Emily Grierson's dusty, decaying house in A Rose for Emily is a prime example, physically manifesting the rot at the heart of the community. His Absalom, Absalom, a classic of Southern Gothic, captures the eeriness of an unfinished past of plantations. The various narrators, Mr. Compson, Rosa, Quentin, and Shreve, don't simply recall the past, they bring it back to life. They fill in gaps and invent details, actively resurrecting Sutpen and his plantation owning family.
Faulkner is a great example for understanding the eerie, because in his fiction, the history hangs in a state of indeterminacy between knowledge and oblivion, presence and absence. Mark Fisher, in The Weird and the Eerie, defines this state of dread in a similar manner, and I quote, "The eerie is constituted by a failure of absence or by a failure of presence. There is something where there should be nothing, or there is nothing where there should be something." Unquote.
That is a great note to end the episode, as all ghost stories flicker between the presence and absence. Please share and subscribe to the Anti Library Podcast.